Welcome back to the conversation. I'm David Shuster. The mayor was definitely intoxicated. That was the testimony of Jason Miller, former Trump White House staffer, describing Rudy Giuliani, a Trump advisor, on election night, the very night when Trump campaign aides were saying, okay, Donald Trump has lost the election, and told him so. And Giuliani, inebriated apparently, was telling Trump, no, keep fighting, declare you've won. That's just one of the sugar plums that has come out of the January 6th Special Investigative Committee hearings. Joining us to talk about this is John Nichols. He's a journalist, author. He's currently the national affairs correspondent for The Nation. He has a must-read piece entitled "Trump's Coup Plot Relied on Giuliani's Inebriated Lies." John, great stuff. Were you surprised when this came out?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's why I'm in journalism. I like to be surprised.
When Giuliani, I thought there were a lot of things that he's done over the last, year and a half that were crazy. And where he had the news conference, getting caught in the Borat scene, some of the, things that, when he had the hair stuff that was leaking. And so I had suspected, okay, maybe he is something of a lush, maybe he does like alcohol. But the idea that on election night, he would be drunk and that's who Trump is listening to.
That's exactly right. And that this wasn't particularly early or late in the evening, right? I mean, he got to the White House at a time when everybody was there for the initial results, and he was clearly arrived by all accounts in an inebriated state. They tried to hustle him away from Trump. They tried to get him. They said, "Well, why don't you go talk to Jared?" Which is, I think, the official White House line, or was the line on any troubled individual. So they tried to get him over to talk to Jared Kushner, but somehow Giuliani kept pushing his way up into the territory where Trump was at. According to Giuliani himself, he spoke to Trump several times. And what Giuliani was saying was completely lunacy, right? It was something that he himself should have known to be totally false. And that was that, at a certain point in the evening, you should declare victory and say that no more votes should be counted, because the additional votes that would be counted might be fraudulent. It was a nuts proposal, one that Trump's campaign aides, his longtime White House aides, his family members all said that's a bad idea. And so, of course, Trump turned to Giuliani and said, well, let's take notes.
What happened? I mean, I'm gonna get back to the January 6th hearing, but what happened to Rudy Giuliani? I mean, he was, a well-respected federal prosecutor, mayor of New York City. I mean, America's mayor with 9/11, did an admirable job in sort of holding people together with all of that. Seemed, like he could have been a, viable presidential candidate, although didn't really do so well when he ran in 2008, I believe. But I mean, what happened to him over the last 5 years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't think it's just the last 5 years. I covered the presidential races that I covered when he was playing around with presidential politics, and it was a mess. He ran lousy campaigns in his later years. So there's pretty good evidence that at a certain point, two things happened. Number one, he sort of lost the thread, i.e. getting out of New York City, which he knew well, and he knew the politics of that place. He sort of fell apart. But number two, it's clear that he is emblematic of a certain kind of politician in the Republican Party, which is that when Trump came along and sort of unscrewed the cork and let the crazy out, these folks, instead of saying, hey, that's wrong, we don't want to go there, and pushing back against it, said, oh wow, this is the new politics, this is who we're going to be. And Giuliani, to a larger extent probably than almost anyone else, embraced this sort of sycophantic relationship with Trump, i.e. telling Trump what he wanted to hear, and then bizarrely acting on it, which wasn't just on election night, but also in that classic scene you referenced where he was at the Four Seasons Total Landscaping parking lot, trying to shut down the Pennsylvania results.
And I almost think with Donald Trump that the hearings have provided a certain sort of glimpse that maybe people feared was there, but didn't really want to believe it. In other words, it was news to me that so many people, the White House staff, campaign operatives, were telling him on election night and the days after, you've lost. This isn't, the numbers aren't there. And the stuff from the attorney general saying, the claims of fraud are not there. And I suppose Donald Trump could have said, okay, well, if they're not there, let's just sort of take a deep breath and see what develops, as opposed to immediately tweeting out, the election was stolen. So what is it about Donald? I mean, is it that much of a psychopath, even worse than people had suspected, that despite people that he relied on telling him it was over, he decides to just go and lie to the American people.
I think that one thing to understand is that most of these people who were around him were lifers. They're Republican Party lifers. They went to Trump because he was the big guy, not because they necessarily liked him or agreed with him. And that certainly refers to Barr, among others. They gave Trump a lot of aid and comfort and support for as long as they could. But when it became clear that Trump wasn't going to be the dominant figure, i.e. he wasn't going to be reelected, they became at least somewhat realistic. Trump didn't like that. And I think the thing to understand about Donald Trump, and I've written about him for a very long time, is that he has never been a politician. He has always been a businessman, a New York businessman, a deal maker. And in that game, sort of shooting big, taking your chances on something that seems crazy is sometimes rewarded. And I think for Trump, that became his mentality. He transferred it into politics where it just doesn't work. I mean, ultimately it did work, I should say, in 2016, but ultimately it becomes sort of a disastrous circumstance.
As I've said to some of my colleagues and people on the air, the January 6th hearings have been unlike most congressional hearings you will ever see. Very succinct, very pointed. It moves along. There seems to have a theme. But what's been your reaction to the two hearings we've had so far and the way that the committee is putting all of this together?
They're clearly well produced, and that's something that, as somebody who's covered politics for a very long time, covered Capitol Hill for a very long time, I'm actually quite happy with. The fact of the matter is, I know there's some people who say, oh, well, it's too quick, it's too made for TV. Well, the fact of the matter is that people's government should be something that they can consume at a relatively quick and reasonable rate. And historically, congressional hearings have been long, boring. Every politician has to have his say or her say, and things are repeated. It doesn't get any place. Usually the first day, as you well know, David, of any sort of major set of hearings doesn't deal with the issues, right? You don't have the witnesses or anything like that. What they clearly decided to do with the January 6th committee is to cut a lot of the rigmarole out, cut a lot of the kind of bureaucracy out, and get to the point. And in doing that, they've actually produced pretty gripping hearings, especially when you're getting kind of deep insights about what's going on inside the White House.
Yeah, gripping for certainly everybody who's watching, everybody who's sort of following politics. It does feel very weighty. It feels heavy. It feels solemn and important. I guess the big question that I would have for everybody, including you, is this breaking through in your estimation? I mean, I think only 20 million watched the first hearing, which is about half what would normally watch a presidential State of the Union. Are the hearings moving things as far as public opinion or moving public perceptions about Donald Trump?
Probably not a lot. Let's be honest, we are an incredibly divided country. So the hearings are going to be very satisfactory to people who had a pretty bad impression of Trump already and now are getting more reinforced on it. They're going to be dismissed by people who are Trump defenders. And we already saw that with Fox to some extent. But here's the subtlety, David. First and foremost, it is the job of members of Congress who swear an oath to the Constitution to get to the bottom of things of this sort and to do the right thing, whether you're moving a political needle or not. So in that regard, I think they're doing the right thing. But second, I do think that there's a great mass of Americans who are not engaged on a daily basis with politics, who don't obsess about it. They get the headlines, they get a little bit of it. The fact that these hearings are putting the word coup into play, that they're clearly identifying Trump as the center of a conspiracy, that may not move everybody, but a substantial portion of Americans, I think, are going to get a new overlay as regards their thinking on Trump. And I do think it will ultimately do some damage to him.
Yeah, and I think you've also put your finger on the pulse of what's really important. That is for historical reasons. I think people will look back 30, 40, 50 years from now and be very sort of pleased and proud of how Congress handled this investigation. Perhaps in some ways, like some of us, when we look back at the old Watergate hearings in certain moments, think, wow, that was really impressive. And clearly the nation and the Constitution was more important. The rule of law was more important than any individual politics. But as far as sort of the next sort of question a lot of people have, there does seem to be a divide, even within the committee about, and you pointed out, Donald Trump at the center of a criminal conspiracy. Do you get the sense that the committee will actually make a criminal referral to the Department of Justice to sort of take this information that's essentially been teed up for them? Or I've seen some reporting that even Liz Cheney is sort of reluctant to do that.
It is a huge internal debate. There is simply no question that there are two things that this committee has to do. Number one, it has to make a recommendation as regards accountability for Trump and those around him. And number two, it has to make recommendations for policy changes that might assure that this will never happen again. And on both of those issues, I can tell you from talking to committee members, there's a debate on how far to go, how aggressive to go, whether it should be a recommendation or sort of a reference that you hope the Department of Justice picks up on. But I can tell you there are members, and frankly, I even think Liz Cheney may fall into this camp, who believe that ultimately some recommendation to the Department of Justice as regards Trump is going to be necessary. Otherwise, the committee, I think that questions start to be asked about why the committee went to all this trouble if it was just to create a report, not to actually get us to someplace. You can't say that there was a coup attempt and that the former president of the United States was at the center of a conspiracy, and then at the end of the saying all this, go, oh, never mind. That doesn't work, I don't think.
And then what kind of pressure does it put on Attorney General Merrick Garland, and what do you think ultimately he will do?
Puts huge pressure on him, and I think that if there is a clear recommendation, I don't believe that he has any choice but to act upon it. It's just a question of how clear that recommendation is, whether it says specifically what he should act upon, and then how he might do so. And of course, as you know, the way the Department of Justice works, it won't be to say immediately we're going to prosecute. It will be to say we're opening an inquiry.
Yeah, and can you imagine if you're a resident of Washington, D.C., you get called in for grand jury service and suddenly you're told, oh yeah, this is a referral from Congress about the president, former president of the United States being at the heart of a criminal conspiracy. Let's start reviewing the information. I mean, talk about incredible pressure on a grand jury as well. But I just get the sense that so many Americans would, at least there'd be a certain satisfaction if the Department of Justice took whatever Congress did and at least presented it to a group of ordinary citizens. In any case, John, thanks as always for doing this. John Nichols, he's the national affairs correspondent for The Nation, also an esteemed author. We appreciate you being on the conversation.
It's an honor to be with you, and a good conversation it was.
And that'll do it for this show. On behalf of Asher Cofield and the entire gang at the Young Turks, I'm David Shuster. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.